Private James Parker stepped off the bus at Fort Bragg, the early morning sun glaring down on the massive training grounds. The air was sharp with the scent of dew-soaked grass, diesel fuel, and freshly polished boots. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, straightened his back, and tried to quiet the steady thrum of nerves in his chest. This wasn't just another base. This was Fort Bragg, home to some of the toughest, most respected soldiers in the United States Army. And here, he was one of the newest recruits, determined to prove he belonged. He had pressed his uniform the night before, running the iron carefully over every crease until it looked as sharp as a blade. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His insignia were stitched on precisely, each thread checked twice. Yet, despite all his preparation, James already felt out of place. His right sleeve carried a patch most soldiers around him didn't recognize. He knew what it meant. He knew the pain and sweat it had cost him to earn it, but to others, it looked foreign. And in the Army, unfamiliar often meant suspicious. As he joined the line forming on the parade field, he felt eyes scanning him. Some glances were casual, others openly curious. Then came the whispers. "Hey, check out his arm," a voice muttered from behind. "Looks like he stitched that thing on himself," another chuckled. James kept his gaze straight ahead. He had trained himself to ignore distractions, to let words roll off his back. Still, the sting was there, sharp as a paper cut. He stood tall, shoulders squared, refusing to flinch. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Dignity, son. They can't take that from you unless you hand it over." A pair of soldiers stepped into line beside him. One, taller and broad-shouldered, smirked openly as he nudged his buddy. "That patch real, Parker? Or you win it in a raffle?" James didn't respond. Silence was often stronger than a weak retort. He fixed his eyes on the flagpole in the distance, the stars and stripes rippling in the breeze. He would not let them see how much the comment burned. The morning air buzzed with tension as more soldiers settled into formation. Boots thudded against the packed earth, belts clinked, and the occasional cough broke the otherwise strict silence. A crow cawed overhead, circling lazily as though mocking their rigidity. James breathed deeply, counting slowly in his head, forcing his racing heart to steady itself. Inspection day always carried weight, but for James, this felt heavier. He had joined the Army to honor his family, to prove to himself that he was capable of more than what small-town North Carolina had offered. Overseas, he had fought for every ounce of recognition, endured sleepless nights under pouring rain, and learned survival in ways he'd never thought possible. That patch on his sleeve wasn't decorative, it was a scar in fabric form. But none of that mattered here, not yet. Here, all they saw was an outsider with an odd insignia. The whispers grew bolder. "Man, I've never even seen that before. Maybe he bought it online. Bet the colonel's gonna rip him apart for that." James clenched his jaw but didn't move. Every word was another test, and he refused. To fail it, a field commander barked an order, snapping everyone into silence. The shuffle of boots ceased. The only sound was the crisp flutter of the flag and the distant hum of engines on the base. James locked his knees, spine rigid, face impassive. Inspection had begun. One by one, the officers moved down the line, sharp-eyed and methodical. They examined uniforms with surgical precision. A speck of dust on a boot here, a crooked button. There, a wrinkle that shouldn't exist. Soldiers swallowed hard as names were called, corrections shouted, and reputations silently adjusted in the minds of their peers. James's heart pounded as the inspection crept closer. He tried to focus on his breathing, inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, but it only made him more aware of how dry his throat had become. He could feel the sweat gathering at his hairline, despite the cool breeze. "Parker," a voice whispered from behind again. "Colonel's gonna laugh you off the field." He wanted to snap back, to say, "This patch means more than you'll ever understand," but he bit his tongue. The Army had taught him many things, and one of them was patience. Words wasted energy. Respect came through actions, not petty comebacks. The Colonel was drawing closer now, his presence impossible to ignore. Colonel Andrews was known for his razor-sharp inspections, and his ability to cut through excuses with a single glance. He was a man who had seen combat, who carried himself with quiet authority, and who demanded nothing less than perfection. Soldiers both respected and feared him. The laughter had stopped now, replaced by tense anticipation. Every soldier in the line seemed to straighten just a little more as Andrews approached. James could feel the collective weight of expectation pressing down on him. His mind flickered back to the long nights overseas, the moments when quitting had seemed easier than pushing forward. He thought of the mud, the endless drills, the pain of failure, and the pride of finally overcoming it. He had worn this patch with honor, even when no one had been watching. Now, all eyes would be on him. The Colonel's polished boots came into view, stopping a few soldiers down. James's chest tightened. He could hear the crisp exchange of words, the corrections issued with sharp authority. Each step brought the Colonel closer. Each pause made the air heavier. James swallowed hard, but his face remained unreadable. He told himself over and over, "You belong here. You earned this. Don't let them see doubt." The whispers had vanished entirely now. The soldiers around him were silent, waiting to see what would happen. The tension was no longer just in James's chest, it filled the entire formation. The mockery of minutes ago had been replaced by curiosity, even dread. And then, finally, Colonel Andrews stood directly in front of him. The Colonel's eyes narrowed as he leaned slightly forward, gaze fixed on James's sleeve. Time seemed to freeze. James's pulse hammered in his ears. Every ounce of ridicule he had endured this. Morning seemed to hang in that single moment, waiting for judgment. The Colonel's expression was unreadable, neither disapproval nor approval, just sharp, calculating observation. James inhaled slowly, bracing himself. The laughter of the other soldiers replayed in his mind like a cruel echo, but he pushed it aside. Whatever came next, he would stand tall. The Colonel's hand twitched, as if about to gesture, and James felt the weight of the entire formation's eyes burning into him. And then silence. A silence so deep, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. That was where the moment hung, suspended between ridicule and revelation, between mockery and respect, the air charged with unspoken tension. The silence that had fallen when the Colonel appeared did not last long. As soon as Colonel Andrews moved past and stopped to inspect the next soldier down the line, the whispers began again, slithering through the ranks like snakes in tall grass. James Parker kept his chin level, eyes locked on the flag in the distance, but his ears caught everything. "Look at him," one voice hissed quietly. "Standing there like he's something special." "That patch," another muttered. "Never even seen it. Probably fake." James's jaw tightened. He wanted to answer, to shout that the patch wasn't fake, that it had been earned in the mud, under fire. In a training program, most of them would never survive. He wanted to tell them about the days when he had gone without sleep, when his body had screamed for rest, and he had kept moving anyway, because quitting wasn't an option. But discipline restrained him. He couldn't break formation. He couldn't respond. A low chuckle rippled through the line, quickly muffled. He probably ironed it on this morning. The laughter spread, a few shoulders shaking, the sound bouncing around like an unwanted echo. It wasn't loud enough to draw the Colonel's attention, but it was sharp enough to slice into James's composure. He clenched his fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms through the fabric of his gloves. "Dignity, son," his father's voice reminded him. "The army teaches you to stand still, but dignity, that comes from inside." James breathed in slowly, through his nose, counting 1, 2, 3. Out through his mouth 1, 2, 3. He repeated the rhythm, anchoring himself against the weight of ridicule. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud, but his posture never wavered. He was a statue, unmoved by the sneers that surrounded him. Still, the words dug deep. "Bet the colonel tears him apart for that thing. He's done before. He's even started. Rookie mistake trying to stand out when you don't belong." James thought of the long journey that had brought him here. The patch was no mistake. It was recognition of training that had tested him to his core. Overseas, he had been part of a grueling program that stripped soldiers down to nothing before, rebuilding them stronger. They had been pushed beyond physical exhaustion, into places where only mental toughness could keep them going. The patch was not just fabric. It was blood, sweat, resilience. But here, on this field, none of that mattered. To these soldiers, it was just something odd, something that didn't fit. And people always laughed at what they didn't understand. James's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, forcing down the rising frustration. He knew the army well enough to understand that respect wasn't automatic. It was earned, often slowly, and sometimes painfully. But part of him burned with the unfairness of it. He had worked harder than most of these men, yet they looked at him as though he were a joke. A soldier to his left leaned slightly, his whisper sharp. "Don't crack, Parker. Don't let him see you sweat." James didn't know if it was meant as advice or sarcasm. He didn't turn his head to find out. The colonel's voice rang. Out again a few soldiers away. "Button undone. Fix it." The soldier scrambled nervously, fumbling to comply. The colonel's boots clicked sharply as he moved on. James kept breathing, steady, controlled. But the laughter started again, faint, but poisonous. A couple of soldiers behind him snickered. "Look at him. He's frozen stiff." Maybe that's what they taught him in fake patch school. James's teeth pressed together so hard his jaw ached. He imagined the training ground overseas, the mud sucking at his boots as he crawled under barbed wire, the rain lashing his back. He thought of the shouts of instructors, the exhaustion, the endless drills. He had survived all of that. He would survive this too. Still, the sting of humiliation was real. The colonel was getting closer. James could hear the faint scuff of his polished boots on the dirt. The laughter behind him faded into nervous silence as the colonel's presence loomed larger. Every soldier in line seemed to draw in their breath, stiffening, eyes forward. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the entire formation was caught. In a storm that had yet to break, James's pulse quickened. He could feel it thudding against his throat. Sweat prickled beneath his collar, sliding down his back in slow, unwelcome trails. His mind raced, not with excuses or explanations, but with a single mantra: hold steady, hold steady. The whispers died completely now. The colonel was near. The soldiers who had been laughing seconds ago stood stiff, masks of discipline plastered across their faces. James wanted to smirk at their sudden silence, but he didn't. He kept his expression neutral, his eyes locked on the horizon. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing any reaction. But inside, his thoughts churned. Do they even understand what this patch means? Do they know the nights I went without food, the miles I marched with bleeding feet, the drills that left me shaking, barely able to stand? Do they know how many quit? How many couldn't take it? And I stayed. I finished. I earned this. This isn't a joke. This is who I am. The colonel was only a few soldiers away now. Each pause, each correction, each step forward tightened the knot in James's stomach. He exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to stay square, his chin high. This was his moment, whether it ended in humiliation or vindication. The whispers and laughter, cruel as they had been, had only steeled his resolve. No matter what happened, James Parker would not bend. And when Colonel Andrews finally stopped in front of him, the entire line seemed to stop breathing. Colonel Andrews was a man who carried authority in every step. His boots struck the dirt with deliberate precision, the sound of leather soles snapping like a metronome that measured the heartbeat of the entire formation. The soldiers didn't just stand straighter when he walked past. They almost seemed to shrink inward, as if bracing against the weight of his presence. He wasn't a loud man, nor one to bark orders unnecessarily. Yet his reputation traveled ahead of him like thunder, before lightning. He was the officer who missed nothing, the one who could spot a smudge on a boot at 30 paces, or a loose thread on a sleeve, as though it were under a magnifying glass. James Parker had heard the stories long before this inspection. Andrews was the type of colonel who believed discipline wasn't in grand gestures, but in the smallest details. If you couldn't take care of your uniform, how could you be trusted with a mission? If you couldn't respect the basics, how could you be trusted with men's lives? The colonel was 5 soldiers down the line now. His voice, low and precise, carried just enough to sting without ever needing to rise. Collars uneven, fix it. Yes, sir. Dust on the toe cap. Not acceptable. Sir, yes, sir. The men scrambled to correct themselves, hands trembling, eyes darting like prey under a predator's shadow. James held perfectly still, but inside, his stomach churned. Every click of the colonel's boots grew louder, closer. Each pause ratcheted up the pressure. He felt sweat drip from his temple, tickling its way down his cheek. He wanted to brush it away, but of course he couldn't move. 3 soldiers away now. The colonel stopped, his gaze raking over the man before him. Back. Straight, chin higher. The soldier obeyed instantly. Andrews nodded once, sharply, then moved on. 2 soldiers away. James's heartbeat seemed to sync with the colonel's steps-heavy, deliberate thuds that filled his chest. He thought of all the whispers, the laughter, the muttered insults about his patch. Those men had fallen silent now, hiding behind masks of obedience, but he could still feel their eyes burning into him. They were waiting for him to be humiliated. They expected the colonel to tear him apart. Let them think that, James told himself. Let them wait. I'll stand tall until the last second. 1 soldier away. Colonel Andrews stopped in front of Corporal Rivera, a stocky man with close-cropped hair. His eyes darted nervously as the colonel leaned in, examining the spacing of his ribbons. "These are misaligned," Andrews said, his tone like cold steel. Rivera's voice shook. "Apologies, sir. I'll correct it." "See that you do." Andrews straightened, his gaze sliding over to James. Then he stepped forward. And suddenly, it was James's turn. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The heat of the sun, the weight of his uniform, the hundreds of tiny sounds around him, all of it faded. There was only the colonel's eyes, sharp and focused, locking onto the patch on James's sleeve. Andrews did not speak immediately. He didn't rush. He studied the patch the way a jeweler studies a stone, looking for flaws invisible to anyone else. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. James forced himself not to fidget, not to swallow too loudly, not to let the nerves betray him. Every instinct screamed at him to explain, to defend himself before judgment was passed. But discipline won. He remained silent, immovable. Behind him, a soldier stifled a cough. Another shifted uncomfortably. The entire line seemed to lean forward, waiting for the verdict. James's thoughts spun. He knows what it is. He has to. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe he thinks it's wrong. Maybe he'll rip it off my sleeve right here. Maybe they'll all laugh louder than before. Maybe. The colonel's lips pressed together. Then, very slowly, he raised his head, his gaze shifting from the patch to James's face. James felt the weight of that stare, like a physical force pressing into him. It wasn't anger, nor confusion. It was something else: calculation, recognition. The silence grew heavier. Seconds dragged into what felt like minutes. James's heart pounded so hard, he wondered if everyone could hear it. And then, at last, Colonel Andrews opened his mouth to speak. Colonel Andrews's silence was suffocating. He stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the patch stitched onto James Parker's sleeve. The sun caught the threads just right, the insignia glowing faintly against the drab green of the uniform. The moment stretched, taut and unbearable, every soldier in formation holding their breath. James's pulse hammered in his ears. He willed himself not to break eye contact, though the urge to look away gnawed at him. His mind replayed every mocking whisper he'd endured that morning, every sneer and smirk. This was the moment they had been waiting for: the colonel's judgment. Finally, Andrews straightened. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate, and clear enough for the entire formation to hear. "Private Parker," he said, his tone neither harsh nor kind, but firm. "That patch you wear outranks half the soldiers standing here." The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was absolute, as though the world itself had frozen in shock. Then, slowly, the murmurs began, soft at first, then swelling into a ripple of disbelief. "What did he just say? Outranks half of us?" James blinked, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. Relief and pride surged in his chest, but he held his composure, refusing to let emotion break through. The colonel's words weren't just a defense. They were a declaration, a revelation that turned the laughter of moments ago into shame. Andrews's gaze swept the line. "For those of you who find humor in mocking what you don't understand," he said, voice tightening, "let this serve as a reminder. Every patch, every stripe, every insignia tells a story. Some of those stories are written in sweat, some in sacrifice, some in blood." The soldiers stood rigid, eyes forward, but James could feel the shift in the air. The smirks had vanished, replaced by unease, even guilt. The men who had whispered the loudest were now stone-faced, their silence betraying their embarrassment. The colonel stepped closer to James, his voice dropping slightly, though still audible. "This insignia," he explained, pointing briefly to the patch, "is awarded to soldiers who complete one of the most grueling reconnaissance training programs in existence. Fewer than 10% make it through. Parker here did, overseas, while most of you were still learning how to keep your boots clean." The ripple grew again, but this time it wasn't laughter. It was awe. James felt heat rise in his chest, not from shame, but from vindication. He remembered the endless nights, the exhaustion, the moments when he'd been sure he wouldn't last another day. The patch represented every ounce of pain, every bruise and scar, every step through mud and fire. To have the colonel validate it publicly was a weight lifted, a truth finally spoken aloud. Colonel Andrews turned his attention back to the formation. "Respect isn't about what you think you know," he said. "It's about recognizing that you don't know everything. Parker earned this. More than that, he survived it. And survival, gentlemen, is the foundation of soldiering." A hush fell again, but it was different now. Not mocking, not tense. It was the kind of silence that came from realization, from understanding. James kept his posture perfect, but inside, something shifted. The weight of ridicule that had pressed down on him since Dawn was gone. In its place was a quiet pride, steady and unshakable. He hadn't spoken a single word in his defense, and yet his story had been told, not by him, but by the one man whose voice carried absolute authority. He could feel the soldiers around him sneaking glances, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes filled with new curiosity. A few seemed impressed, others embarrassed, some even ashamed. The laughter of an hour ago seemed childish now, exposed under the colonel's sharp truth. The colonel gave James a single nod, almost imperceptible, then turned his gaze back too. The rest of the line, "Remember this moment," he said firmly. "Because out there, when it matters, no one laughs at the man who can save their life." The words hit hard. Even the toughest soldiers shifted subtly, absorbing the message. For James, the moment was transformative. He realized that he didn't need to fight for respect with words or bravado. His journey, his perseverance, his patch they spoke louder than he ever could. The colonel moved on, continuing down the line, inspecting with the same sharp eye. But the atmosphere had changed. The men were quieter, more thoughtful, their earlier arrogance stripped away. James remained still, but inside he felt lighter. The ridicule he had endured had been flipped in a single sentence. The same patch that had made him a target was now his greatest shield, his badge of honor, his silent declaration of resilience. And as the inspection carried on, one truth echoed louder than any whisper. The colonel's words had not just silenced the laughter. They had rewritten the way James Parker would be seen from that day forward. The colonel didn't rush. After delivering his revelation, he let the silence hang for several heartbeats, forcing the weight of his words to settle into the formation. No one dared whisper now. Even the air seemed still, as if waiting. Then Colonel Andrews gestured toward James's sleeve. "This," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady, "is not just fabric. It is recognition earned the hard way." Private Parker completed a specialized reconnaissance training program that most of you will never attempt, let alone finish. Overseas, this program is designed to push soldiers to their absolute limit. Less than 1 in 10 pass. The murmurs began again, not mocking now, but incredulous. Soldiers glanced at one another, their eyes wide. The same men who had laughed earlier now looked as if they had seen a ghost standing among them. Andrews continued, his voice unwavering. "The training is not about learning how to march in perfect rhythm or how to press your uniform until you can see your reflection in it. It's about survival. It's about endurance. It's about learning who you are when everything comfortable has been stripped away. When you're cold, when you're hungry, when you are beyond exhaustion." His words painted the memory vividly in James's mind. The nights under freezing rain, lying in mud that seeped into his bones. The endless treks with packs so heavy they cut into his shoulders. The hollow ache of hunger when rations ran out. The constant pressure of instructors who seemed determined to break him, to expose weakness, to strip away all pretense until only raw willpower remained. Andrews's eyes scanned the line, holding each soldier accountable. "You think standing here in inspection is hard? Try carrying 80 pounds of gear across 30 miles of jungle on 2 hours of sleep. Try going without food for 3 days while instructors scream in your face, daring you to quit. Try climbing out of freezing water in the dead of night, only to be told to do it again." That is what Parker went through to earn this insignia. The formation was dead silent. Not one soldier moved. The colonel's words carried not just authority, but imagery so real they could almost feel the weight of the rucksack, the bite of cold water, the sting of hunger. James remained motionless, but inside, he relived it all. The endless days and nights, the faces of comrades who had dropped out, defeated. The way his own body had nearly betrayed him, knees swollen, blisters bleeding, muscles screaming. The only thing that had kept him going was stubbornness, that voice inside whispering, "Don't quit. Don't you dare quit." Andrews gestured again at James, and he didn't quit. That's why he stands here now. That's why he wears that patch. And that's why some of you, who mocked him this morning, owe him more than silence. You owe him respect. The words struck like hammers. James heard a faint shuffle, someone adjusting nervously, ashamed. Andrews pressed on. The patch signifies more than survival. It signifies leadership under the worst conditions. Men who complete that program are taught to operate alone, behind enemy lines, cut off from support. They learn to think fast, move silently, adapt instantly. Reconnaissance isn't about charging in with firepower. It's about brains, endurance, and precision. One mistake can cost an entire platoon its life. James's chest swelled, though he kept his posture rigid. He remembered the nights of stealth movement, learning to read terrain in darkness, memorizing maps under the faint glow of a single light. He remembered the quiet dread of knowing that a single sound, a single slip, could mean failure. Andrews's tone sharpened. And yet, despite its difficulty, Private Parker completed it. Not as a sergeant, not as a veteran of 20 years, but as a young soldier who refused to quit. Some of you here think a wrinkle on your sleeve is the worst mistake you'll make. Let me be clear, discipline matters. But there is discipline in surviving what Parker survived, and it runs deeper than neat creases and polished brass. The words carried a sting, aimed not at James, but at the ones who had mocked him. Several soldiers stiffened, guilty under the colonel's gaze. Andrews paused, letting his words sink in. Then, in a quieter but sharper tone, he added, "You laughed at him because you didn't understand. Let me tell you something. Ignorance is no excuse for arrogance. You never know what a soldier has been through. Every patch tells a story, and some stories are worth far more than your assumptions." The lesson was unmistakable. James felt the shift in the air again. This time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was respect, or at least the beginning of it. The same men who had whispered insults earlier now looked at him differently, their eyes heavy with the realization that they had judged too soon. Andrews straightened. This inspection is not just about uniforms. It is about humility, about respect. The man you mocked has endured more hardship than most of you have ever imagined. Remember that the next time you think you see weakness. Sometimes, gentlemen, what looks unusual, what looks strange or out of place, turns out to be strength greater than your own. Silence. Heavy, meaningful silence. James inhaled slowly, steady, calm. Inside, pride welled up, but it wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet pride of knowing that his struggle had been recognized, that his silence in the face of ridicule had been vindicated. The colonel gave one last glance toward James, a faint nod of acknowledgement, before moving down the line. The inspection continued, but nothing was the same. The soldiers stood taller, their eyes more focused. They had been given a lesson, one that went beyond polished boots or pressed uniforms. And James Parker, once the subject of laughter, now stood as a symbol of resilience. For him, the patch no longer felt like just a piece of fabric on his sleeve. It was a voice. It was his story, spoken aloud by the highest authority on the field. And it was finally undeniably heard. The rest of inspection passed in silence, but it wasn't the same silence James had endured earlier. Before, it had been filled with suppressed chuckles, sly whispers, and eyes burning holes into his sleeve. Now, the silence carried a different weight, heavier, contemplative, almost reverent. The mocking had evaporated, replaced with something far more powerful. Respect, or at least the first stirrings of it. When Colonel Andrews finally dismissed the formation, the soldiers broke ranks with the usual shuffle of boots and muted conversations. But this time, James noticed the difference immediately. Instead of turning away from him, men lingered. Instead of sneers, there were stolen glances, curious, hesitant, almost apologetic. Private Daniels, one of the loudest laughers earlier that morning, cleared his throat as he passed James. "Hey, good job out there, man." The words were awkward, clumsy, as though foreign on his tongue, but they carried sincerity. Daniels didn't stop, but his tone was a far cry from the ridicule he had hurled just hours before. James gave a small nod, nothing more. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply acknowledged it. Respect wasn't something you flaunted. It was something you carried with quiet strength. Within minutes, more soldiers approached. Not all at once, not openly, but in twos and threes, drifting toward him with questions thinly veiled as casual comments. "So, Parker," said Corporal Rivera, scratching the back of his neck, "what was that training like?" Colonel made it sound intense. James hesitated, eyes scanning the group gathering around him. There was genuine interest in their expressions now, not derision. "It was intense," he said simply. "Hardest thing I've ever done." "Like, what do they make you do?" Another asked, his tone careful, almost respectful. James thought for a moment. He didn't want to boast. Everything designed to make you quit. Long marches with heavy gear. Sleep deprivation. Hunger, cold, and constant pressure. They test if you'll break. Most do. The small crowd listened closely, nodding. The same men who had mocked him earlier now leaned in as though his words carried the weight of gospel. Rivera let out a low whistle. "Damn, and you finished it?" James gave a slight shrug. "Yeah." The soldiers exchanged looks, some impressed, others clearly humbled. Daniels muttered again. "Respect, man. That's no joke." For the first time since arriving, James felt the heavy burden of being the outsider lift slightly. The patch that had once branded him as different now became a magnet for curiosity, even admiration. As the day went on, the change grew more obvious. In the mess hall, men who had earlier avoided his table now chose to sit nearby. Conversations shifted naturally toward him, questions popping up between bites of food. "How do you keep going with no sleep? What's the trick to those? Long marches? Ever think of quitting?" James answered with humility, never embellishing, never dramatizing. "No trick, just keep moving. Quitting crossed my mind plenty, but once you quit, you live with it forever." That last line struck a chord. A quiet murmur spread across the table as men absorbed it. Later, during drills, James noticed the way others glanced at him, not with skepticism, but with an edge of deference. When he executed a maneuver flawlessly, a few nodded subtly, acknowledging his skill. When an instructor barked corrections at the group, James caught sight of soldiers copying his stance, his posture, his way of holding his weapon. The shift wasn't complete. Respect in the military was never instant, never absolute. But the foundation had been laid. James himself felt different. He stood taller, though not from arrogance. His confidence was quiet, steady, grounded in the knowledge that he had nothing left to prove. The colonel's words had stripped away the doubt that others had tried to pin on him. Now, every step he took was lighter, every order executed with greater ease. But respect came with a new weight as well. He could feel the expectations now. The same men who had laughed at him would be watching closely, waiting to see if he lived up to the colonel's praise. He couldn't falter, not now. His patch wasn't just cloth. It was a promise. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the training grounds, a small group gathered outside the barracks. Rivera, Daniels, and a few others lingered, hesitant but curious. "Parker," Rivera began, "you mind telling us one of the hardest parts of that training? Something that stuck with you?" James thought for a moment. The memories flooded back, some too raw to share. Finally, he nodded. There was a night in the mountains. Snowstorm hit. We'd been marching for 14 hours already. No food left. Half the guys dropped out. I remember sitting there, shaking so hard I thought my bones would snap. Instructor told us only 1 in 10 would make it, and he looked right at me, like he knew I wouldn't. That was the moment. Either quit or prove him wrong. The men listened silently, the weight of the story sinking in. Daniels finally said, "And you proved him wrong." James allowed a faint smile. "Yeah, barely." The group chuckled softly, not mockery this time, but genuine respect. As they drifted away, James stood alone for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of orange and gold. He realized something profound. Respect wasn't about loud declarations or flashy gestures. It was about persistence, humility, and letting actions speak louder than words. The colonel had given him a platform, but it was up to James to build on it. And slowly, surely, he was. The following morning, the soldiers gathered once more on the parade ground. The air was crisp, the sun still low, painting the barracks in long shadows. James took his place in formation, steady as ever. But the atmosphere around him had shifted. There was no whispering now, no sideways smirks. Instead, the men stood straighter, quieter, as though the ground itself demanded reverence. Colonel Andrews appeared right on time. His boots struck the pavement with measured force, echoing across the silent yard. He stopped at the front, hands clasped behind his back, and surveyed the company. "Yesterday," he began, his voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the morning stillness, "you learned a lesson. But I want to make sure you understand it." The soldiers held their breath. Andrews paced slowly, his eyes scanning each man as though peering into their very thoughts. Some of you thought a wrinkle in a uniform was worth laughter. Some of you believed an unusual patch was a weakness. You saw difference, and you mocked it. He paused. But you were wrong. The words hit like a hammer. A few men shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on the horizon. Andrews stopped in front of James, gesturing toward his sleeve. "Private Parker wears a patch that tells a story. A story none of you knew. A story of endurance, of suffering, of pushing beyond human limits. You judged the cloth. You did not respect the man." Silence. Heavy, unrelenting. The colonel's gaze hardened. "That, gentlemen, is arrogance. And arrogance will get you killed on the battlefield." He let the words hang, sinking in deep. The men shifted again, but this time it wasn't out of guilt alone. It was recognition. Andrews had pulled the veil back, showing them their flaw with brutal clarity. Every patch, every stripe, every scar tells a story, Andrews continued. You don't always know it. You don't always see it, but it is there. And the day you laugh at a fellow soldier for something you don't understand is the day you expose your own ignorance. Colonel's tone deepened, carrying the weight of decades of service. Humility is not optional in this profession. Respect is not optional. A soldier who cannot respect his brothers will not stand with them in combat. He will fail them. And failure in combat is measured not in shame, but in blood. The formation stood frozen. No one dared to blink. Andrews turned again, pacing. I have buried men braver than any of you. Men who carried stories you will never know. Some looked ordinary, unimpressive, until the moment came when their courage saved lives. Others wore strange patches, marks of training you could not imagine. And not once did it matter what their uniform looked like in an inspection line. What mattered was what they carried inside. James's chest tightened as he listened. The colonel wasn't just speaking to the soldiers, he was speaking to him too. It felt like his own journey was being woven into a universal lesson, one that stretched far beyond his patch. Andrews's voice sharpened. You think discipline is about polish, about looking perfect. Wrong. Discipline is about knowing when to keep your mouth shut. Discipline is about humility. Discipline is about learning before you judge and respecting before you mock. His words struck deeper than any shouted command. This wasn't a lecture on uniforms. It was a blueprint for survival, for brotherhood. F.O. honor. Finally, Andrews stopped pacing and faced the formation head-on. Gentlemen, let me be clear. Yesterday, Parker didn't need to defend himself. His record, his patch, his endurance spoke louder than your words. But not every soldier has a colonel standing behind him to explain his worth. That is why you must never be so quick to judge. You never know the battles someone has already fought and survived before standing next to you in line. The silence grew heavier, but it wasn't shame alone now. It was reflection. The men were thinking of their own stories, their own patches, their own struggles yet unseen. Andrews lowered his tone, almost solemn now. When you laugh at a soldier, you don't just laugh at fabric. You laugh at pain you cannot imagine. You laugh at the nights he nearly froze, the days he marched with bleeding feet, the moments he thought of quitting but didn't. You laugh at the ghosts he carries, the sacrifices he's made. Is that who you want to be? No one moved. Number one dared. James felt the lesson sear into him as much as the others. Though he had been the target of their mockery, he too understood the weight of the colonel's words. Respect wasn't about one patch, one man, or one inspection. It was about the foundation of trust that held them all together. The colonel drew in a breath, his voice rising once more. You are soldiers of the United States Army. That title demands humility. It demands brotherhood. It demands that, when you stand in line, you do not look for weakness to mock, but for strength to honor. Because when the bullets fly, when the chaos erupts, the man beside you is not just a uniform. He is your lifeline. He is the reason you live another day. The truth of it landed hard. Finally, Andrews gave a single, sharp nod. Remember this lesson. Carry it. Live it. Because one day, it may be the only thing that keeps you alive. Then, with no further ceremony, he dismissed the company. The soldiers broke ranks slowly, as though reluctant to move. Their faces, or the weight of reflection, their steps subdued. No one spoke immediately, but the message was carved into them. James lingered, watching them scatter. For the first time, he saw no mockery, no dismissal. Instead, there was respect, quiet and unspoken, but undeniable. Several soldiers met his eyes briefly, nodding, acknowledging him not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The colonel's words had transformed the patch from a target into a symbol. And James realized that the lesson wasn't just for them, it was for him too. Respect, once earned, was no longer his to guard alone. It was now a bond shared by the entire company. The morning after Colonel Andrews' speech, the air around the barracks felt changed. The laughter that had once greeted James in quiet corners was gone. Where there had been dismissive glances, there were now nods of recognition. Soldiers who had once made him feel like an outsider now moved a little closer in formation, their steps falling into rhythm with his. Respect had not been announced or declared. It had been earned, forged by truth, and sealed by the colonels. Lesson. But redemption, James knew, wasn't found in words alone. It would be proven in action. That test came sooner than expected. 2 days later, the company was sent on a grueling 20-mile ruck march through rough terrain. Packs weighed heavy, boots sank into mud, and the August sun bore down like a hammer. For many, it was the hardest exercise they had yet faced. Muscles ached, water ran low, and every mile felt longer than the last. James kept his pace steady, his breathing measured. He had endured worse mountains, storms, sleepless nights, but he remembered the colonel's warning. The real test was how you carried others, not just yourself. Halfway through the march, Daniels began to falter. His steps grew uneven, his face flushed red, his breath ragged. The same soldier who had once laughed the loudest now looked like he might collapse. The group pressed on, instructors shouting for them to keep pace, but James slowed without hesitation. "Grab your strap," James said firmly, moving beside him. Daniels blinked, sweat dripping into his eyes. "What?" "No, I'll slow you down." "Grab it," James repeated, slipping his arm under Daniels's pack and taking part of the weight. For the next several miles, James bore not only his own load, but part of Daniels's as well. His shoulders burned, his legs screamed, but he never wavered. Slowly, Daniels steadied, his pace falling back into rhythm with James's. Other soldiers noticed. The same men who had once sneered now watched in silence as James carried his brother without complaint. The lesson Colonel Andrews had spoken about was no longer abstract. It was happening in front of their eyes. When they finally reached the checkpoint, Daniels collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. James dropped beside him, exhausted but calm. Daniels looked up, shame flickering across his face. "Why'd you do that?" James met his eyes steadily. "Because one day, I might need someone to do the same for me." The words cut deeper than any lecture. Daniels swallowed hard, nodding slowly, respect shining in his expression. By the time the march ended, whispers had spread through the unit. Not mocking whispers this time, but words of admiration. Parker carried Daniels. Didn't slow down once. "That guy's tougher than nails." The redemption had begun to take shape. That evening, back in the barracks, Rivera approached James. He stood awkwardly for a moment, scratching his neck before speaking. "Listen, about the other day. The inspection. The jokes. That was wrong. We were wrong." James looked at him, his expression unreadable. Rivera pressed on. "You proved more than any of us could have imagined. And today you didn't have to help Daniels, but you did. That says everything." James let the silence linger before replying. "Respect doesn't come from patches or words. It comes from how you show up when it counts." Rivera nodded firmly. "Yeah, and you showed up." From that night forward, James was no longer the subject of jokes. He was the soldier others sought out for advice, the one they watched quietly during drills, the one they trusted when the pressure mounted. The outsider had become an anchor. A week later, during a tactical exercise, the company faced a simulated ambush. Smoke grenades filled the air, instructors barked orders, and chaos reigned. In the confusion, a squad froze, unable to move forward under the simulated fire. James reacted instinctively. He shouted clear, precise directions, pulling men into cover, guiding their movement with the calm authority of someone who had lived through worse. By the end of the drill, the squad had regrouped successfully, and the instructors noted his quick thinking. More importantly, the soldiers who had once dismissed him followed his lead without hesitation. When the exercise ended, Daniels clapped him on the shoulder. "Man, you're not just one of us, you're the one we need." For James, that moment meant more than any medal or ribbon. Redemption wasn't about personal glory. It was about becoming part of something larger, about earning trust through sacrifice and consistency. Word of his transformation spread. Colonel Andrews observed quietly, never intervening, but the faintest of smiles tugged at his lips when he saw how the unit had changed. His lesson had taken root, and James had become its living embodiment. One evening, as the sun set behind the barracks, Andrews called James aside. They stood in the quiet glow of twilight, the sounds of the company fading behind them. "You've done well," Andrews said simply. James shook his head. "I just did what I had to." "That's the point," Andrews replied. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "A soldier doesn't chase respect. He earns it by showing up when it matters most. You've done that. And because of it, your brothers will follow you anywhere." James felt the truth settle in his chest. The laughter, the doubt, the whispers, all of it had been burned away. What remained was trust, forged in hardship and sealed with humility. Weeks later, the company stood in formation again, ready for another inspection. The air was sharp. The uniforms pressed. But this time, when James stepped into line, there were no smirks, no snickers. Daniel stood beside him, posture sharp, expression proud. Rivera gave him a small nod. The others stood with quiet solidarity. When Colonel Andrews walked past, his gaze lingered briefly on James's patch. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any speech. James realized then that redemption wasn't a single moment. It was a journey, built mile by mile, choice by choice. The patch that had once drawn ridicule had become a symbol of resilience, not just for him, but for everyone who stood beside him. And as the company stood together, stronger and more united than ever, James understood the truth. Respect wasn't given, and it wasn't taken. It was lived, and he had lived it.